Now it's time for us to plan the report. And it doesn't matter what kind of chart you're given. You always need to answer 3 questions to determine what needs to be figured out in advance. So number 1, that is the first question that you need to answer. Question number 1, or the first question that you need to answer is, how can I divide the data into 2 or 3 parts? Okay, this is question number 1. You always need to look at your data and ask yourself, how can I logically divide this information into 2 or 3 parts? Now, you might be wondering, why 2 or 3? Like, what's the big deal here? Why do I need to write either 2 or 3? Why do I need to come up with 2 or 3 parts? And the answer is simple. These will form your body paragraphs. So if you can logically divide the data into 2 parts, then you're going to have 2 body paragraphs. If you divide the information into 3 parts, then you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. But remember, there should be a very clear logic behind your paragraphs. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll just write 3 sentences in the first paragraph, and then I'll move to the second one and I'll write 3 more. No, that's not how it works. When I am reading your response, or when the examiner is reading your response, we should immediately know what the rationale is, what the logic is for breaking these paragraphs. Is it just random, or do you have a clear logic? Now, the logic doesn't have to be very complicated. It can be very simple logic. For example, in this pie chart that you see here, we have percentage of male athletes and percentage of female athletes. So it makes sense for us to have 2 body paragraphs. Why is that? Well, because we're going to write 1 paragraph for male athletes and 1 for female athletes. It's very clear. In fact, it's so clear that it's really hard to do it any other way. The easiest, most straightforward approach to this is to write 2 paragraphs, right? And this kind of helps answer a very important question. And that is, when you're dealing with combination charts, when you're dealing with 2 pie charts or a line graph and a table and maybe a pie chart, you basically write 1 paragraph for each of these kinds of charts, right? So if you have 2 pie charts, you have 2 body paragraphs. If you have a line graph and a table, again, you're probably going to have 2 paragraphs, 1 for the table and 1 for the pie chart, or whatever that second chart happens to be. Okay, so that's question number 1. Following this question, the second question you'll need to ask yourself is, how can I summarize each part into 2 to 3 sentences? If you remember, in IELTS Task 1, one of the expectations of the task is for you to write a response that is between 150 to 200 words and also summarizes the information. Now, if I describe everything I see in these 2 pie charts, how many sentences will I end up writing? Well, I know I have 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, if I write 1 sentence for basketball, 1 for swimming, 1 for track and field, 1 for cycling, 1 for chess, and 1 for table tennis, I will have written 6 sentences. And I'll probably have to do the same, right? Because I can't write 6 sentences describing the percentage of male athletes, but only 2 sentences for females. That way, I will not have balance across my paragraphs. So I need to have the same number of sentences in my paragraphs. Now, on average, this isn't a hard rule, but on average, you will achieve 150 to 200 words by having 2 or 3 paragraphs, which are each 2 or 3 sentences long. And so in some cases, you will need to only select 3 pieces of information to include. And in other cases, you will need to compress the information and include more information in only 2 or 3 sentences. But regardless of which approach you adopt, remember, each of your paragraphs should ideally be 2 or 3 sentences. If it gets any longer than that, then you run the risk of writing a response that is too long, perhaps exceeding 200 words, or writing a response that falls short of the 150 word requirement. In this case, let's try to consider how we would write a response. I have 6 sports, right? So 6 sports for male athletes and 6 sports for female athletes. So if I can't mention everything, how about I focus on the highest percentage? So for example, for male athletes, the highest percentage belong to cycling, right? So highest, the most, the number 1 ranking, variable, that's always important. You want to include that. So one sentence can be the highest. Another sentence can be focused on the smallest percentage. So look, chess, for example, isn't a game that's of a lot of interest to male students. In fact, the smallest percentage of male athletes chose to play chess. So as you can see, whenever we're trying to summarize the information, our aim is to focus on highest, lowest, right? So ranks, things that rank number 1 or rank number 10, highest and lowest. So in this case, we have 2 sentences figured out. What about the rest? Am I going to ignore the rest? Well, here's the deal. What you could emphasize, in addition to the highest and lowest amount, is anything that is either a set proportion. So for example, you could say basketball forms almost a quarter or approximately a quarter of male athletes, or attracts a quarter of the male athletes. As you can see, I'm focusing on a proportion, a percentage, a fraction that is worthy of reporting. Or for example, that swimming constitutes only 10%, right? Or something along those lines. You could focus on similarities as well. You could say among male athletes, track and field and swimming seem to devote the same percentage of male athletes to themselves. Now, the question that remains is, should I mention everything? Well, you need to ask yourself this question. Can I mention everything in 2 or 3 sentences? In this case, I believe I can, because it's manageable to report 6 numbers in 3 sentences. But if you're dealing with, let's say, a table that has 3 columns and, let's say, 10 rows, then how are you going to summarize 10 numbers in 3 sentences? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's difficult and you'll need to really carefully think about it. In this case, here's how I would do it. I would write 1 sentence that focuses on the highest percentage and the second highest percentage. That is, cycling and basketball formed the number 1 and number 2 sports among male athletes. And I'm going to mention the numbers, right? So 34% followed by basketball, which was 26%. Note that I've only written 1 sentence so far, right? But this 1 sentence represents 2 numbers, basketball and cycling, cycling and basketball, which happen to be the first and the second ranking sports among male athletes. Okay, what about my second sentence? Well, in my second sentence, I could perhaps mention how chess is the least common sport among male athletes, right? So I could mention that here. And then what remains is 3. I have table tennis, swimming, and track and field. Can I mention all 3 numbers in a third sentence? Probably. I could say, while swimming and track and field attract the same percentage of male athletes, table tennis accounts for 17% of male athletes in Australia. As you can see, I managed to explain everything and cover all of these numbers that you could see in the chart in only 3 sentences. Now, you could try to do the same for female athletes. See if you can possibly summarize all the information in 2 or 3 sentences. If you can't, you may have to ignore some of the information. So once again, just to make it a little bit more clear, let's imagine instead of 5 or 6 sports, we had 15 sports in each of these pie charts. Now, granted, the pie chart is going to look very confusing. It's going to have lots of colors and figures in it. But for the sake of argument, let's say we have 15 categories in a pie chart. If we have 15 categories, there is no way I'm going to be able to mention 15 sports and how they're ranked along with their numbers in only 3 sentences, in 2 to 3 sentences. So what am I going to do instead? Easy. I'm just going to report the highest, the lowest, those that are similar or close in percentage or number, and also any notable fractions or percentages that could be mentioned. Finally, the third question that I need you to answer is regarding the main points. If you recall, in the description section, we always had subject noun MP, the subject verb MP. In the instruction section, we were always told to summarize the information, right? By selecting and reporting the main features, which is sort of what we've done, right? We summarize the information only by selecting the highest, the lowest, the similarities, right? The main features, and then make comparisons where relevant. Remember, this was also part of the task. Make comparisons where relevant. There are so many comparisons that I could make in these 2 pie charts. I could compare male basketball players to female basketball players. I could compare male basketball players to male cyclists. Or I could compare table tennis among female athletes to table tennis among male athletes, or table tennis athletes compared to track and field female athletes. So many dimensions of comparison. And there's really no way I can include every single comparison, because you just do the basic math. You're going to have a lot of possible comparisons to make. So if I can't draw all those comparisons, then I'll probably need to limit myself to 1 or 2 comparisons that are very meaningful, that help us understand what's generally going on among male and female athletes in Australia, right? So you want to draw a comparison that could serve as a key point. And we're going to call these important comparisons key points, or sometimes I refer to them as vital information. Vital information is the essential information that must always come out of a good response. So the third question is, how can I identify 2 pieces of vital information in the chart? Okay, so we need to find 2 pieces of vital information. Let's take a look at this pie chart right now, and let's see what kind of comparison would make sense. Well, if we look at the highest percentages, we'll see that among females, it seems that basketball is number 1, right? So we have 27%, all other numbers fall below. Among male athletes, it seems that cycling is number 1, and basketball is number 2, right? And look, what other similarities do you see? Well, I can see that swimming is identical. We have 10% of male athletes showing an interest in swimming, and also 10% of female athletes showing a proclivity towards this sport. So what do we see? What are the points of departure? That is stark contrasts that you can see in these pie charts. And what are the points of similarity? For me, the 10% swimming, which is equal among male and female athletes, stands out. this can serve as one meaningful comparison. Another meaningful comparison for me is that in both cases, both male and female athletes, around 1/4. Now, you see, the numbers aren't absolute. It's approximate, right? Approximately a quarter of male and female athletes were attracted to basketball. So you can see, I'm focusing on the similarities. Always draw a comparison and find meaningful similarities. But similarities aren't the only feature that you could include in your response. Sometimes it's stark contrast. For example, the biggest difference among male and female athletes seems to be in their interest in chess. So while 21% of female athletes enjoyed chess or played chess, only 2% of male athletes were interested in this sport. So as you can see, when it comes to identifying this vital piece of information, if you have a combination chart, like these two pie charts that you can see here, I want you to compare the two and see what kind of meaningful similarities or meaningful distinctions you can find. And these will be presented as key features of our report. Okay, now, by answering these questions, 1, I've guaranteed that I've understood the chart, and number 2, I am certain that I know how many paragraphs I'm going to write. I know I will be writing 2 paragraphs. I know how many sentences I'll be including in each of my paragraphs. In this case, remember, I have 3 sentences for male athletes, where I represent all 6 numbers actually, and I'm going to include 3 sentences for female athletes representing everything. And the key points that I will be putting on the forefront and really bringing to the examiner's attention, just to show the examiner that I've found this information, is any kind of meaningful similarity or any stark contrast that I can see between these charts.